Hello, my name is Rob Pollard. I'm going to take you, through some tips on how to solo multiplayer tabletop RPG adventures. You know, the published books that you can buy from most online retailers. So, firstly, spoilers. So, I'm going to be presenting a number of concrete examples, and the reason for that is I feel I can get the concepts across a little bit better with examples from my actual play. That way you can actually see what I'm writing and so forth. But to that end, it meant that I had to obviously play some real adventures to make this work. So there are three, and the three are Lost Miner Phandelver, which is a Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition starter set adventure. Now, in terms of this one, if you look where the cursor is, I'm probably going to discuss everything up to around the Redbrand ruffians. I won't be covering anything after that, so that's all safe. So if you're playing this with a games master and you're after the ruffians, go ahead and watch it. But otherwise, I highly recommend you don't watch this video if you intend to play this. Also, I'll be taking you through Mission to Mithril, which is Mongoose Traveller's Second March's adventure. Very, very good adventure. And the reason why I'll be taking examples from that one is it's an overland adventure. It's effectively one big road trip on, cross-country trip as opposed to road trip, because there aren't any roads there. But it's an overland journey. And there are some things you can think about to help make that journey a memorable one. And then the final one is Paper Chase. That's from the starter set of Chaosium's called Cthulhu. Very, very good adventure. And the reason why I chose Paper Chase is it's a very narrative driven adventure in that, in fact, when I played it, I don't think there was any combat at all. So if you compare that with Dungeons & Dragons, where you're nearly always doing some kind of combat, in that one there is hardly none at all. And I was just curious to see how that would solo, and it turns out it solos very, very well indeed. So the bottom line is, if you intend to play any of these and you want to remain spoiler free, then you're going to have to look at some other YouTube videos. Now, that said, when I go through this, I'm obviously not going to spill the beans on everything, and I'll try and limit what I say about the adventures, but there might be some things that come out, so hence this spoilers warning. So, overview. This is just a broad overview of what I intend to cover in the video. Now, I know you might not be interested in all of these bits and bobs, and if you're not, if you go down into the description, there are various time codes and timestamps that will take you to the appropriate section, and that way you can watch just the bits that you're interested in. If you want to fully read this, just pause the video and read at your own leisure. So, solo styles of play. I thought I'd cover this first because it's important to know what I'm going to be discussing in this video and what I'm not going to be discussing. So I guess the first style of solo play is literally you pick up a published adventure, one that's designed for multiple people, and you try and play it solo. And that is actually the style of play that I'm going to cover here. And I would say up front that I'm presenting to you the way I play these adventures, and there is no right or wrong way. What works for me might not work for you. And I highly suggest you take advantage of YouTube's search facility and find other viewpoints on how to run these adventures. But hopefully, after watching this video, you'll come away with some good ideas that you can use in your own adventures. So the other way to play solo adventures, I do what I call the random adventures, and there are various systems out there for this, which I've not used yet. Some of them use cards, others use lookout tables, and in general they spell out a situation, and then you kind of role play that situation, and then occasionally roll dice or pull cards to see the direction of adventure. So the advantage of those kind of adventures is you literally have no idea where it's going to go, like none at all. So it's very good in that respect, and you get a lot of freedom. But as I say, I've not actually done one of those type of adventures yet, so I can't really do a video on that. But when I do, I'll put one up and then give you some of my viewpoints on that. Finally, there's the third kind of solo adventure, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and that's the actual dedicated solo adventure books. And on the right there is a picture of Chaosium's, Call of Cthulhu's, Alone Against the Flames, which is in the starter set. And all of these adventures follow the usual: read a paragraph, and then it might make you jump to another paragraph, or it might give you various options to go to whichever paragraph based on the option that you've chosen, or maybe roll some dice. Now, of the 3 different ways of playing a game solo, this is by far the most restricted and the most on rails by a long way. And that's because you're limited in your actions by the options presented on the paragraphs. You can't go and decide to do something else entirely different, because that something else entirely different hasn't been written into the book. But although they have that downside, they are by far the easiest to run. Everyone knows how to run these. You quite literally open the book and follow it. And they also make great tutorials for rules, because the writers can actually set them up to hold the player's hand through some of the main concepts of the rule set that they're learning. So they're very good at that. And I've played quite a few of these because I enjoy playing them, and I'm sure most other people do. But just be aware you don't get the full role-playing experience with them, simply because you are quite railroaded in what you can do. So what do you need to play? This is quite important. So the first one is imagination, and that is by far the most important thing you need to play. And in fact, if you have an incredibly good imagination, you don't need anything else. You don't even need rules, because you can quite literally use your imagination to imagine the scenario. Although many people do use rules in order to help regulate what's happening in their game. Although there are various approaches. You can either go the simulation approach, where you're actually using the rules as quite a big crutch to tell you what's going on in the game. But there's also narrative-based rules, which are fairly loose, and they rely more on you and the players, if it's a multiplayer game, pushing the narrative along. But yeah, imagination is by far the biggest ingredient. Now, you might be thinking, what if I can't imagine anything? Well, a lot of that's down to little sparks that spark your imagination off. And at the very least, the adventure should be giving you little ideas. If it's not, then perhaps you've picked the wrong adventure. Maybe you need to pick a different one. But also the setting might help as well. So there are all these little sparks, and we'll go into that a little bit later on. Next thing you need, if you're playing pen and paper like a lot of people do, is the adventure books, rules, dice, and obviously a pen and paper to do it on. And generally speaking, with imagination and that, you can run most tabletop role-playing games quite easily with just those things. But there are some optional extras. So one thing that I found invaluable is a paid scanner stroke printer, and a lot of printers you buy nowadays are also paid scanners. And the reason for this is many of us don't like writing in our books. You buy these really expensive adventure books, and the last thing you want to do is deface them, especially on the maps where you're trying to plot where you're going. So having a printer scanner is very good for that, because you can use it to scan off maps and then print them off, and then you can draw on your printed off version rather than the actual map. And in fact, some companies are really good. Chaosium's one, another's Mongoose Publishing, in that if you buy any of their physical books, both of those companies will give you the PDF version as well for free. And I think that's remarkably good of them. But that helps you with your venturing, because it gives you the ability to more easily pull out the maps to play on. And at the end of the day, I think it helps them sell more product as well, because if you're helping the players are more likely to like the system, and they'll go and buy more anyway. So yeah, page scanner, printer, very handy, and also for character sheets, printers, character sheets, very good combination. Also, figures and props. Now, there are people that play purely with theatre of the mind. That's great. But there are other people that sometimes prefer more tactical games, and in those cases, having those figures and props really does help you imagine what's going on. I tend to fall, well, I suppose it depends on what kind of game I'm playing. I generally fall on the let's have a map in front of me and some counters on it versus just purely imagination, because I find a map really helps spring my imagination and get it to think of things, whereas if you don't have a map in front of you, sometimes it can be hard to imagine what's going on. But a lot of people don't have problems with it, and in fact with the Call of Cthulhu paper chase adventure, which I'll show you some examples on, though I had a map, I didn't really use it because it was nearly all theatre of the mind at the end of the day for that one, and it worked really well. And then finally, computer aids. Now, I'm guessing most of you have computers because, you're watching a YouTube video, although you could be watching this on the phone. But I imagine quite a few of you have computers these days. And there's a lot of software out there that will really help you to play your games. Now, in my case, although I have a computer and although I'm pretty good at using one, I actually started off just using pen and paper because I felt that was the traditional way of doing it. The problem for me, though, is my handwriting is terrible. And what I found was that I'd look back at some of my adventures and I literally couldn't read the writing. It's like it had self-encrypted itself overnight. So for me, I had to abandon doing things completely pen and paper, and I had to move some of the things that I do onto the computer. And I first started using Notepad, which was okay, but that had some downsides. And then I started using virtual tabletops. I actually bought a few of the commercial ones, but I found that the ones I had bought, firstly, some of them were quite expensive, but secondly, whilst they were incredibly good at what they're designed for, which is multiplayer gaming across the internet, they were quite poor from a solo perspective. And there are numerous reasons for that. So these days, I actually use computer aid or VTT that I wrote myself, specifically for solo play. It's called Sojour. A lot of the bits and bobs I'm going to show you are going to be in Sojour, but don't feel that you need Sojour to play these games solo, because you absolutely don't. The only reason why I'm showing you Sojour is because firstly, I'm a little bit biased because I wrote it, but secondly, because that's what my games are in. And that's the only reason. Had I had my games in a different VTT, or maybe if I had them more in Notepad, I would have shown you those as my examples, but I don't have that. They're all in Sojour. So like I say, don't imagine for 1 second you need Sojour. It's just the tool I've chosen to use for myself. Right, surprise and perspective. Now, I thought I'd cover this one off early because it's quite a common question. So imagine you've bought your adventure book and you've now got a little bit of a problem, and that is, how do you read it? And it's a crazy question really, because everyone knows how to read, but the problem about the approach to reading it is how it affects your surprise in the game, because a lot of people, when they're playing a role-playing game, not only are they doing it for the narrative, for the fun and the social elements, but they're also doing it for some of the surprises that jump out from the story. And you have to learn to take a solo player's perspective on surprise, basically. And there are basically two ways of doing this. The first way of doing this is to quite literally take your published adventure and read it end to end. Now you might be thinking, oh, but won't that spoil the surprise? And you're kind of right, but you're also kind of wrong as well. And the reason why is because you are still getting surprised. When you read that book for the first time, you're getting your surprise then and there. It's just that you're getting it up front. You're not getting it at the same time that it's happening whilst the story's running. And instead, when you're playing a game solo, you'll get your surprises from other means, usually from various dice rolls and things. So you can think of it as front-loaded surprise. You're still getting it. It's just that you're getting it up front. And that's what a lot of games masters that run multiplayer games take a lot of pleasure out of. That they'll be reading these published adventures and going through it and thinking, oh my god, that's a bit of a plot twist, and and they gain pleasure from doing that. And that's, I guess, takes us onto the perspective of how you play these things, in that you need to move away from being a player to a certain extent, and you need to think in terms of being more like a games master. And the only difference is between you and a multiplayer games master is that you're managing the NPCs and the player characters. You're managing both at the same time. And because of that, for me at least, when I play my adventures solo, I have no distinction between an NPC and a player character, none at all. Because in my mind, they're all controlled by me, the so-called GM. So if you view the playing of the adventure from the point of view of being a GM as opposed to a player, I think you'll find it easier to deal with the fact that some of the surprise you're going to have will be earlier rather than later on. But that's the first way. That's reading the book end to end. And for some complex campaigns or scenarios, you really do have to read it end to end. Otherwise, you're just going to have problems running the adventure. But the other way of doing it is to read just enough to get you going. And many games kind of help you out in that, in the way that they're structured. And I find especially a lot of the Dungeons and Dragons games, because they tend to box things out and they tend to present things in order of the way things are happening, it's very easy with a Dungeons and Dragons scenario to just read what you need to read. If you move into a particular cavern in a cave, you can go to that section in the scenario, read the little description, and then do your role playing off that without necessarily reading the rest. Now, in terms of the 3 adventures that I've put spoiler warnings for, I believe the Lost Mines and Paper Chase, both of those, I only read as much as I needed to know. So I was almost getting the surprises at the same time my characters were getting them because of the way I did it. Although in the case of Lost Mines, there is a mechanism in there to see that the goblins in the first cave are actually quite switched on, and they have a really great defensive mechanism. So I did have to read a little bit ahead on that one to figure out how to run that part. And yes, I got surprised a little bit earlier, but it wasn't that much earlier than my characters got surprised, and I still got surprised. That's the key thing. So you're still retaining the surprise. It's just that the temporal element of that surprise isn't in the same place as it would be if you were playing in a multiplayer game. So the way I look at it, you're not really losing surprise, you're just getting it at some other point in time. Now the travel adventure, because that's overland and because that's more free for all, I kind of read that one end to end because it was kind of necessary to learn the mechanics of that planet, and I'll show you that later on. So that's why I want to talk about surprise and perspective. So I guess don't be afraid to read your scenarios, just know up front when you're going to get your surprise and how you manage that, and as long as you understand that you're still getting surprise and still getting value from reading the book, I think you'll be fine. Now I'd like to talk about the 3 sparks. As I mentioned earlier, imagination is by far the most important aspect of solo role playing, but there are certain things you can do to enable you to fire off that imagination. And if you have a very vivid imagination, perhaps you don't need to do these things, but in my experience I've found that by doing these things it really helps drive the story forward, which is what you want. So the first and possibly most important thing is narrative. You need a way of keeping track of narrative, and the great thing with narrative is by keeping track of it, it helps generate more narrative. And I found by far the best way of doing this, and this might seem a bit weird to some people who've never heard of this before, is by literally journaling and writing down what's going on in your adventure, almost like a book. And I found that one discovery transformed my solo role-playing experience. Because before I started journaling things, my exposure to role-playing games was basically from a mechanical perspective, where you'd roll some characters and maybe I'd do a combat-focused dungeon, maybe I don't know, Rainbow Mounds, for instance, in RuneQuest, which is fairly combat-focused. And of course, if you're just concentrating on the combat mechanics, you're not necessarily doing any role-playing. Now, at the time, I was very young and I didn't think anything of it. I thought, yeah, this is it. This is where it's at. This combat's awesome. But you are missing out on a lot of what makes role-playing if you don't create narrative. Now, writing it down has many, many advantages. Firstly, it gives you some evidence of what you've done, and it's really handy, because especially if you don't play every day, maybe you play once a week, it's nice to look at your narrative from the previous week, and then you can quite easily jump off. But the other great thing with writing down a narrative is it forces you to think about the narrative, because you obviously can't just write down random stuff. You actually have to take a little bit of thought and imagine what might be happening. And it's that step where you're thinking, oh, what am I going to write? It's that step that helps create the narrative. And it just makes it a lot easier. And you'll find that all sorts of surprising things come out of the woodwork that you wouldn't necessarily think of if you weren't actually writing it down. So if there's anything you take away from this video, the one takeaway should be, try to write down your ventures as they're happening. Write down the narrative, journal it. That's the big takeaway, and it's a secret. Once you do that, it transforms a role-playing game from a mechanical rules-following exercise to a proper role-playing experience with just a single person. And I've played Dungeons and Dragons, Call of Cthulhu, and so forth using this approach, and I've had whole sessions, 3 or 4 hours, where I literally have not consulted any rules or rolled any dice. It was all narrative driven, but it was fun. It was really good fun. And of course, I will show you many concrete examples from adventures that I've played solo, from the 3 that I mentioned earlier. So what else do you need to keep track of to help fire off your imagination? The other thing is time. Time is pretty important. And it's one of those things that can be quite easily overlooked, because nobody likes time tracking, because it can be a right pain unless you've got some tooling. But it enables several things. Firstly, it helps establish the pulse of the story. If you've got a good grasp of what time of day it is and the day-night cycles, that in of itself drives a narrative, because you get this feeling of time passing. And if you don't keep track of time, it all becomes this one big bit of grey narrative, which it seems to be missing something. And also, keeping track of time helps you imagine situations. Obviously sunrise, you can imagine the party getting up. Lunchtime, you can imagine a meeting, and so forth. And if you didn't keep track of that time, you wouldn't know that it was lunchtime, unless you wouldn't be able to create the narrative for them finding a place to eat, for instance. So yeah, time's very important, and again I'll show you some real concrete examples for that. And then finally is a sense of place, and for me place is also very important. Place, it means not just the place where the adventure is taking place, it also means the general world at large, because remember, your characters are part of a bigger world, and you do kind of need to take that into account. And I find the richer the world, the more it helps you create the narrative. Like, for example, one of my favourite role-playing games of all time is Chaosium's RuneQuest. I've played a lot of it, mainly 2nd and 3rd edition, but I am starting to buy their newer stuff. And RuneQuest comes with an excellent world called Glorantha, and that world is a very, very rich world, and quite different from many other worlds. But it's so rich that just having a map and in conjunction with the lore, i.e. the place, it helps me generate narrative. I could just look at a map and immediately start thinking up stuff that would occur there simply because of the richness of the world and of the map. So I highly recommend that you also keep track of where your characters are in the world. Now, I know there are many people that do theatre of the mind, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But with theatre of the mind, you need a pretty strong imagination. Otherwise, you're kind of limited to what you can think of then and there. Whereas if you have a map in front of you with maybe some counters represent where your characters are, that in of itself can help drive your thoughts about what's going on, especially if you add in the other bits like time of day, maybe the weather as well, and perhaps start thinking about some of the other senses like what's the smell like there and so forth, things you don't normally think about, and by thinking about those when you're writing a narrative, it helps generate a richer narrative. So yeah, in my experience, if you keep track of narrative by journaling it, time by having some kind of calendar, and place by having a map, if you keep track of those three things, you will end up with a great role-playing experience with a rich narrative. So this all sounds pretty theoretical right now, so what I'm going to do, I'll take you to my VTT and I'll show you some of the stuff that I've written for some of these commercial adventures, and that way you can get a sense for at least how I do it. And as I've mentioned earlier, the way I do things isn't necessarily the right way, it's just a way of doing it, and it might not even be suitable for your play style, but hopefully it will give you some ideas. So over to the concrete examples. Right, so this is Sojour. It's a solo focused VTT, and in fact it's one I wrote because I found many of the commercial VTTs weren't too good for solo play, which is why I wrote my own. Now, as I've said before, that there is no need to have Sojour, like zero need at all. And everything I'm about to show you in Sojour, you can do with pen and paper or some other tool. The only reason why I'm using this tool is firstly, all of my adventures are in it, and secondly, for the ones that aren't, the ones that I have on pen and paper, my writing's terrible. I can't read it, so there's a very good chance you can't read it, which is why I'm showing you stuff from this tool. But as I said, owning Sojour, you don't need it. You absolutely don't need it. It's just a nice to have. So one of the most common questions I've seen on the forums is, how much do you write? What do you write? So let's take a look at a few adventures that I've done. So look at Lost Mines first, and this is the back to Phandelver bit. It's a bit we've done the Cragmore hideout scenario, and we're kind of heading back. So this is the stuff that I wrote. If I can zoom that in a little bit more just to make it a bit easier to see. So I believe in keeping my journals relatively short. I don't like writing too much, because if you write too much, you can actually get in the way. And that site is wrong. So I take a more minimalist approach than perhaps some people. And what I nearly always do is I establish the three things that I talked about earlier. We have the narrative, which is writing it down, and this, the journal part, the bit where you're actually writing this stuff, that is by far the most important part, and we'll go through why. But also note, I'm keeping track of time. So I know exactly what time it is. It's 8:30 in the morning, 17th Marathon 1481. So, and you'll see it throughout here, like an hour has gone by, 4 hours has gone by, and so forth. And that really helps drive narrative as well, especially when you combine it with like external factors. Like here, I rolled for the weather, and that helped generate the kind of text I'm writing. Like I kicked off this particular chapter with the party wakes up late at around midday. So this clock's actually changed since, and that's because I'm actually further forward than this. The skies are dull grey and a howling wind is driving the light rain directly at us. So already, in 2 sentences, I've kind of set the tone of what's going on. Now, this is a great example, this initial part, because what's actually happened is my party had a journey to make. Basically, they were here at the Cragmore hideout and they had to get to Phandelver, which is where they currently are. That's why all the clocks gone out of date. Now, the question is, how much do you write for this journey? And it's a really good question. And for me, it's based on the story. So Lost Mines is primarily about Phandelver and the various places you visit. The journeys are almost inconsequential. Now you could role play the journey step by step, but it's almost not worth it. Now in this case, I did role play a little bit of the initial journey from Neverwinter to Phandelver simply because an important ambush happens around here. So I wanted to establish what the weather was like, what the time of day was when they got ambushed, all that kind of thing to help generate that narrative. But on this part of the story, we've done the hideout and now we're heading to Phandelver itself, and I felt this was a journey that didn't have any consequence. Now, you could, if you wish, completely roleplay that and write down their journey through the fields, but in my mind it would be inconsequential to the story, and where it is inconsequential, it's almost not worth writing. So basically you end up with everyone breaks camp relatively quickly, and after around an hour we make it to the trail, which is here, so we have to walk down to there, and then a paragraph later, which is 4 hours later in game time, I've made it to Phandelver, and I almost didn't write anything. I quite literally say we arrive at Phandelver at around 1700, which is 5 o'clock. So I felt there was no need in this case to detail a journey, but there are exceptions, and I'll cover that in a second. And of course, because I know what the weather is, because I know what the exact time is, that helps my mind. So I know the sun's about to set, the weather's got a little bit better, only a little bit, and my party is soaked to the skin because on the way it was raining, and that all helps to establish in your mind what's going on, especially that time of day thing, because without the time of day you have no idea. And at 5 o'clock you could be thinking about who's around, and like here I note that the shops are closing soon, and it's all these little bits that you can add to the narrative that help drive it. And again, this next section here, it's all like talking or role playing basically. So, and it's not something, if you weren't writing a narrative down in a journal, you wouldn't necessarily do this, but because I am writing a narrative, it almost forces me to think this way. And like here, basically, Sildar, who isn't really part of our party, he's someone we found, tells us to go to a local inn, and we head there, and then AIS, who's like the leader of the party, is then going off to find out more. And basically that's all in, where it's Phandelver, isn't it, which is this map here. So we are now all there, but there is... I think AIS was up here to talk about the provisions, and again the fact that I'm journaling it encourages me to write the speech and the communications basically, and I said without being forced to write anything at all, this you might not think of doing this, and you might just go the purely mechanical route of, yeah, my party's arrived, they're in the inn, it's the next day, we're off to the next dungeon, and you just miss out on an entire part of your narrative. And if you do it that way, you're missing out on what makes multiplayer games good, all the communications and interplay between the characters. And what you find is, as you do the discussions, you'll find that little bits, you think of little tiny ideas that will come out in the communications, and those little ideas can set seeds for further ideas. So it's really worth doing. And one of the advantages of many of the modern RPG systems is that when you look at the character sheets, in fact, let's open up the actual full character sheet. A lot of the newer systems, they almost set you up with many, I guess, characteristics, your character, like for instance his ideals for AIS, greater good, and our lives to lay down our lives, defense others, and all this kind of stuff here. And by like this is a classic one, I'd rather eat my armor than admit I'm wrong. So just by knowing that one statement, it means that you can incorporate that into your narrative and help drive the narrative. And nearly all modern role-playing games incorporate this kind of thing. You just need to keep track of that to help drive narrative. Now, as I mentioned, in this case, the overland journey to Phandelver was inconsequential, so not much was written. But where are circumstances where it would be consequential? So a great example would be in Traveller, in Mission to Mithril. Now this one isn't going to look as nice because this is literally a copy and paste of text I wrote from Notepad. But as you can see, this is purely overland, over the landmass of Mithril. I literally put in an entry for every single day, pretty much. And some of them are quite substantial. And you're probably thinking, wow, how did you come up with all this stuff? What is literally just moving across a few hexes? And again, it's all down to several things. Firstly, it's down to being forced to write it in the first place. Because in Mithril's case, had I not been forced to write anything, the first problem is that all you'll do is just roll the dice on the adventure to work out how far you travelled, and then move a little piece on the map, and then roll the dice again, move a little piece on the map. And it's not really a fun experience. It's more of a mechanical thing. Whereas by writing it down, I get to document what's happening. Now, here, again, a little bit like Dungeons and Dragons, Traveller's very good at establishing various background bits of information for your characters. So like here, for example, I talk about who owns which bit of the ship, and it actually helped create a great meta plot, and it's always great having this overarching plot. So in this case, Tarquin he's a noble, but he's been away from his estate, and basically his sister claimed he was dead and took the estate, in essence. And ever since then, his sister has been hunting him down to actually kill him for real. So he and his bodyguard Steve, they've kind of they're using I believe it's a hunting ship, a safari ship, rather than a standard posh yacht, in order to try and evade being found by his sister. So the story for that particular campaign, it already has this background arc behind it, but in addition to that, I have these individual adventures. Now, again, notice how I'm keeping track of time, and by keeping track of time, it helps drive your imagination. Like here, I know it's near the end of the day, so they can't possibly drive out straight away, so they decide to go out, first light the next day. I'm also keeping track of food and time and so forth. And one of the great things here is I started thinking, okay, I need to write about this journey over this planet. And you got 4 people there crammed into an all-terrain vehicle. So I was thinking to myself, okay, if I was there in that situation, what would we do? How would we do it? Given that none of them could really drive very well, I thought, I think in real life you'd create a roster. And this table imported really badly from Notepad, but basically I created a roster of who's driving on what part of the day of each day. And it's crazy because had I not had to write a narrative, I wouldn't even have bothered with a roster. But this roster led to some really great narrative experiences, because the way the roster works, sometimes a character would get away with not actually doing anything because like the weather was so bad they couldn't drive on his watch, and other things like that, and then it leads to a back and forth between the characters. But as I said, because in Mission to Mithril's case, the adventure is the journey as opposed to the destination, although there is some adventure there. In this case, I documented every single day. And it's kind of crazy in of itself in that it took me a long time to do this, because I think I originally did this on pen and paper, and I think it took me 2 weeks to play it, and because basically a day would come up, I'd roll the dice of how far I'd move, I'd roll for the weather, I'd then look up the crew roster to see who's doing what and when, and then I'd kind of force myself to think of something to say about that day. Even if it's only like a 1 or 2 liner. And that just helped make things a lot richer than they would have otherwise been. So I can imagine a lot of people that have played Mission to Mithril solo would just be rolling on the tables and moving this little counter across the planet rather than thinking about it each and every day. And of course it takes a long time to roleplay this way, but what it meant was that by the time I finished this journey, which is across I think about a quarter of the planet, I think it goes up to, what day did they get up to? Let me just go, day 32. By the time it came to the end of this particular adventure, it genuinely felt like 32 days. It felt like 32 days in a crammed all-terrain vehicle. And because I wrote down every day and what happened, including some of the parties that they had and to celebrate various things and things that went wrong, because all of this is written down, I had this journey etched into my mind like no other thing. It's almost like I'd really done this journey for real, simply because I'd taken time to put all this detail in, and because all that detail was there, it just fired off my imagination. And this is a far better way than just, I say, roll the dice, move a counter on the map. A far better way of doing it. And the only reason this came about at all was simply because I'm writing it down. Because I'm writing the narrative, I'm forced to think about what to write. Like I say, once you know the relationship between your characters, and I say that there's quite a complicated relationship between all these two. Like these two, Tarquin and his bodyguard, they've been together for ages. Although people who don't know that his bodyguard has special built-in prosthetic armor, and the other two are that they've met from in the services. But even the way the ship is laid out, the parts of it are zoned off for the different characters, and it works really well, and it helps generate that narrative, because Mission to Mithril could have so easily been a really boring adventure of dice rolling, moving something over an overland map, but by taking the time to narrate it, it became much more than that. And you know, even to this day, I still think back to this adventure and think, wow, that was an epic drive across that continent, and it felt epic because of the real amount of time it took to do. And that's why sometimes it's worth investing that time to make the journey feel epic. But going back to the Dungeons and Dragons one, if you're doing like the Sword Coast thing here, where I'm just traveling from here to here, that I say completely inconsequential. It has no real bearing on the story, so there's no need to write about it. Just put a 1 or 2 line sentence, and because we're keeping track of time, that again helps your mind imagine, you know, by knowing it's 5 in the evening and knowing a little bit about the weather and stuff, you can imagine just by looking at the map, you can imagine what your characters are seeing as they come down the main road, and the combination of, you know, the sun setting, the bad weather, the muddy roads, all of that helps your mind generate the narrative. And I say, for me, I love having maps with characters on it like this, because again that helps. It's another crutch for generating the narrative. So I have the time and dates helping with the narrative. I have external effects like weather. and I have the place, and it all goes together to work towards this whole. And if you understand the relationship between your characters well enough, and as I say, most modern role-playing games, they help you establish those relationships. And if you know that well enough, that in of itself will help with the role-playing. And I'd say here, quite a lot of role-playing happened here. And, you know, I didn't even roll dice, and I really enjoyed that. And, you know, it was only later on that I think, was it the following day? In fact, yeah, all of this, I believe, was just role-played. So I played Dungeons & Dragons solo without rolling a single dice for an entire session. And look at this. I wrote all this down. And the thing is, because I wrote it down and narrated it, this is in my head, like a bit like that traveller across Mithril journey. It's in my head, and I can visualise exactly what happened. And it's only like the following day that I think they get jumped by a bunch of bandits. And again, generating the what's said helps. Like AI is telling Elmar to get inside and lock the doors, we'll deal with these lowlifes. And then the bandits responded, lowlifes, say, kill them. We asked nicely, now we do things the hard way. And this brings us to combat. Now, combat... Again, you can follow the mechanical approach and, you know, just roll those dice. And, you know, that's fine. But, again, you're missing out on a lot. So I'm just going to read out this first paragraph because for those of you who know, Dungeons & Dragons combat is literally rolling a d20. And, you know, you either hit and do damage or you don't do anything. And you know, you could write down on here what the dice rolls were and leave it at that. But that doesn't make for great narrative. So you compare with, I don't know, I rolled a 20 and hit such and such for 12 points of damage. Compare that with what I've put for this first paragraph, for instance, where I go, Cora sidelines Evander and charges straight toward the nearest thug. Her sword flashes out at dizzying speed and strikes the thug directly opposite her, drawing blood as her sword slices through the air. Before the thug can even react, her foot comes round with a roundhouse kick and hits the thug square in the chops. The thug recovers and is looking a little stunned and worse for wear. And, you know, even the thug's response, rather than just rolling the dice and saying what happened, I elaborate on it again. It's like the thug wildly swings his short sword in an effort to keep Cora away. His first blow is narrowly dodged by Cora's quick movements. However, the second swing connects and hits Cora straight in the belly. She looks somewhat taken aback by it as blood pours from her abdomen. So again, we're elaborating on it. We've got Cora, who's a fine martial artist, suddenly thinking, oh my god, I can be damaged. And that helps for the narrative. And again, these characters all have something behind them, like Garion. He's a magic user, but he's never been outside of his school, basically. So as part of his education, he's been allowed to go outside, and he's had Cora accompany him as his protection, basically, whilst he learns a bit about the world. And by elaborating on why your characters are together, it does help drive the plot. And again, going back to character sheets I showed earlier, the fact that you have all these little quirks that your characters have, as long as you remember what they are, that helps drive what is said as well. So you see that this combat, that's a lot more exciting than just rolling a d20, writing down what you rolled on here, and just taking off the hit points. Way more exciting. And of course, this is keeping track of time as well, because this VTT does that, and you can tell what's going on. And again, we a little bit of role playing happening after the fact. What we'll do now, we'll look at the Call of Cthulhu adventure Paper Chase, because that's a very different kind of adventure, because there's not so much action going on it. It's a very narrative driven adventure. I just want to prove that such adventures can be run solo and successfully. And I think in Paper Chase, I rolled maybe 6 or 7 dice for the entire adventure, and there was no combat. So I ended up writing all of this stuff here, and it became a very memorable adventure. And again, you can see all the usual bits and bobs. We've got time tracking. Occasionally I used a map, although to be honest, I didn't really need the map for this. Where are we? Yeah, Douglas World, wasn't it? So I occasionally used the map, especially when I got towards the end of the adventure where stuff was happening in the old graveyard with old Douglas. But on the whole, this is a very narrative-driven adventure, and it relies on you creating that narrative. And of course, if you're not writing it down, how are you going to create it unless you just do it in your head? In which case, that becomes, I guess, a little bit trickier. And what I want to do, let's see if I can find a particular incident where time quite literally triggered off something. So yeah, turns out, right, here we go. So here I knew after an hour had gone by. Remember, this clock is a lot further forward than it was at this particular point in the adventure, because obviously this adventure has been played. But at this point, Kaiko had done some investigations. I don't think she found anything, but I looked at the time, and the time was like midday, and I was immediately thinking, well, Kaiko's in town, or what would she do at midday? And then I thought, oh yeah, and I wrote down, as it's nearly lunchtime, Kaiko finds a bench at the edge of the houses, presumably in a park, and decides to sit down and eat some food, and she took with her. And I also mentioned a little bit about the weather and how cold it is, because, and this is March, and March can be quite cold. And you're getting all these little prompts to add, like, oh, I'm cold, or I'm going to have lunch, by the date and time. So this is why keeping track of time is so important. And then that led on to an actual built-in encounter with an elderly lady called Leela. And Leela's actually part of the adventure. But because I was now sat down on a bench eating sandwiches at lunchtime, I could shoehorn that encounter in to what I created in my head, the lunchtime thing. And it just fits very, very well. And, they have the role-played discussion, and then Kaiko finishes off her sandwich, and then heads on back. But on here, the time tracking really helps, because you can see how many days had gone by, and what was, and it gave you tips on what to do at particular times of the day. I mean, how long was this adventure in terms of game time? If I scroll down, I think it made it to day 4. I believe, yeah, day 4, and I've called it the Discovery. And you get a sense about what your character's about. Like, for instance, Kaiko discovered the truth about Douglas Kimbo, which I won't necessarily go into right now because that really is a spoiler. But she kind of lies to cover that up, mainly to protect him and Thomas, and that's why, and I role-played that bit, and this is all made up. It's not in the adventure anywhere. It's just that when you get to know your character and you get to know the characters they're interacting with, you can make stuff up like this. And basically Thomas is asking, how did your vigil go, because she stayed up overnight in this building, and she's kind of semi-lying. She says, we have a result, and Thomas is a little bit surprised, and then she says, it was a young kid. He was looking for expensive-looking books to pawn. He didn't bank on me being there, and I gave him quite a fright. So she kind of lied to say what had happened that night, but also at the same time managing to close the case off. And all of this dialogue came by knowing the characters and basically expanding on the narrative that got created as I ran through the adventure. And this was a great adventure. It really was. And this is the first time I've played Call of the Cthulhu. I'm used to the basic role-playing system from RuneQuest, but this is the first time, and I was curious. I bought the starter set, and I was wondering whether such an RPG could be soloed, and it was really good fun, even though I rolled very few dice. But because I was sat there reading little snippets from the adventure book, and as I mentioned earlier, for this particular adventure, I only read as much as I needed to read, and you can get a sense for that. And I'd read a little bit, and then I'd role play, and of course time's going by, and that helps drive things on. And before you know it, because the narrative system kind of forces you to write something, before you know you're inventing all this stuff and creating stuff, and yeah, it turned out to be a really good adventure and an exciting one. And because of that, I've now bought a lot of Call of the Cthulhu books now, because I really enjoyed soloing, and I didn't even think it would be possible to solo this game, but you can. So I think that's all I want to cover right now. I'm hoping, and you can pause the video at any time to actually see what I've written in little snippets what I've written in these journals, just to get an idea of what's there. But I'm hoping it gives you an idea of maybe how much you can type. Now, obviously, it's very biased to the way I do things, and you might want to type more or you might want to type less. But the key ingredient, the key takeaway from this entire video is, if you're going to play solo, try journaling. It makes a massive difference. And I say, when I first watched a YouTuber say or talk about journaling, by the way, this isn't my idea. This is absolutely not my idea. In fact, before I learned about journaling, I didn't even think playing an RPG solo was possible. I just didn't think it was something you could do. But anyway, this YouTuber, who I forget who it was, I'm sorry, but he mentioned journal your adventures, and I was listening to him and I'm thinking, how can that possibly work? How can the act of writing down something change the way the game works? But it really does, because you're writing stuff down, you're having to think about what you're writing down, and then you're thinking in terms of narrative, you're thinking in terms of what people are saying to people, and it just enables you to think. And when you combine the story flow from your written adventure with the time and what's going on the map, all three come together to give you these narrative ideas and drive the story forward. And as I said, a lot of these adventures, they're, to me, they're almost like they happen for real. They're that vivid because I took this approach. I say, feel free to ask questions on the YouTube thing. If there's anything you want me to elaborate on, again, feel free to ask on there, and I can put some comments in. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a homemade VTT. I've got it for sale on, I think, DriveThruRPG for $10, but absolutely not mandatory. You can do all of this with just a pen and a piece of paper, your dice, your rule book, and your adventure, and that's all you need. Now, there's one more thing I'd like to finish off on, and it's an incredibly important topic, so stick around for the next bit. Right, death and failure. This is a very important topic for solo gaming, and the reason why I mention this specifically is because of the way some multiplayer games are run. So generally speaking, in a multiplayer game, you'll have your players, and you'll have a games master, and the games master normally has some kind of screen between them and the players so they can hide their notes. And one of the games master's jobs is to keep the story flowing and to make sure their players are having fun. That's kind of their key role. And one of the ways that they do this is occasionally, and hopefully only occasionally if they're good GM, they'll fudge a few rolls in order to make things more dramatic, or to keep a player alive for a particular thing, and they'll occasionally fudge a roll. And that's fine, because in a multiplayer game, although the GM knows they've done it, the players don't. So from a player's perspective, the adventure is just as dangerous as it's always been because they don't know they've been bailed out of a situation. However, in a solo game, you can't do that because like you're the only person playing. So if you were to fudge any kind of roll by like re-rolling it or whatever, you know about it and you're the one playing the game as well. It's not like you can hide it from yourself. And that presents problems because the minute you start bailing your character out, the more you end up doing it. It becomes a bit of a drug. And the problem is that the adventurers lose their sense of danger. And that really takes a lot away from the adventure. And this is a really hard thing to do because many people get attached to their characters. Especially, the more scenarios they've been through and the better they've got in their virtual world, the more attached people tend to become to them. You form that bond, and it's very difficult to let go. So when you see that dice roll that kills them, it's very easy when you're a solo player because there's no one looking over your shoulder. Yeah, I'll just re-roll that because the sun hit the dice in the wrong way and it needs re-rolling. So you re-roll it, and lo and behold, your character got through. So, like I say, this is a personal opinion of mine, but I think as a solo player, you should not fudge any dice rolls. Just don't do it. It's a slippery slope, and if you don't do it, then that increases the danger, and you feel the danger. That's the key thing. So not only are you getting all the benefits of the surprises, the story, the narrative, everything else, but you also have that real sense this is a dangerous adventure. My character could die at any time. And sometimes, death can be a good thing, because if a well-loved character dies, that sticks with you. It almost becomes like a real death in some respects. You kind of mourn the loss of this character you've grown attached to, maybe over several months or even several years. But that helps in of itself in the narrative, that the very fact that it's hit you low in the stomach and you remember what happens to that character. Characters don't live in isolation. They'll have family, they'll have friends, they might be part of some bigger organization, so that their death can trigger pulling other people into the adventure to find out what happened to them. You can get some quite poignant storylines when some of their friends come in and find out what actually did happen to their friend. So yeah, I highly recommend, and I know it's really, really difficult to have the discipline for this, but I highly recommend you do not fudge dice rolls in a solo game. Multiplayer games, if you're the GM, great. You can do it occasionally, and only occasionally, because if you do it too often, most players will know what you're up to, and then for them, they lose the danger. But for a solo player, as I've said, you can't hide from yourself. And it's one of the reasons why when I play solo, I roll real dice rather than using a computerized dice. Even though like the VTT I wrote, Sojour, that will do dice, I never use them personally, because if something bad happens to my character, I want to know it was my dice and my dodgy rolling that did it, as opposed to some computer algorithm. So yeah, that's what I want to say about that on the death side, is respect your dice. And if you do that and you take your characters through to their natural ends, it will make your follow-on adventures much better, simply because there's a much bigger element of danger to them. Now, on the failure side, there are some places in some adventures where, your characters have to do something in order to get somewhere. Maybe they need to find a secret door to push the story on. So, and they can fail. They can quite easily fail that role. So what do? Do you hold the adventure off at that point and just walk away? Well, the way I do it is, in my mind, you have the fortitude of the player with regard to wanting to carry out the task, in this case maybe searching for a secret door, versus the fortitude of the character. Now you have to remember that time passes differently in the game than it does in real life. So, searching for a secret door, whilst for you it might be literally a one-word sentence in a journal, for a character doing it, they could be spending a good 10-15 minutes doing this. And you can imagine if you were doing it in real life, you know, by your third or fourth attempt, you might be thinking, I don't want to be doing this anymore. I want to do something else. And you might even start believing that there's nothing there. So I highly recommend, in terms of failure, yes, have your characters retry, but if you're keeping track of time, be aware that the rest of the world's going on around them, and time itself might present its own pressures, like, oh my god, it's getting dark, I have to do this before it's dark, or maybe they're running out of supplies. So time can certainly help focus it, but also I would suggest that after, I don't know, the second or third attempt, you start rolling on one of the characters' characteristics to determine whether they do have the fortitude to carry on. And, you know, at the end of the day, if they fail this critical thing, you know, which, you know, halts the whole adventure, and that can happen, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because that in itself, especially if you're playing in a big campaign, that can present its own narrative in the fact that, you know, your adventurers went somewhere where they were told there would be these bandits hiding, and they never found them, and they thought the villagers were giving them bad information and so forth, and that can set up its own future narratives. That the very fact that now your characters no longer trust the villagers that sent them there. And you wouldn't get that narrative if you always followed things through to make things successful. So being able to fail can be a good thing. And, you know, you don't have to have your characters discover every mystery or clear out every dungeon. As long as you get some narrative worth out of what they've done that up to that point in time is great. And being able to look back at your characters' journals and see both their successes and their failures, it gives you a much more rounded experience. Whereas if it's a continual list that reads off like a CV of successes, then it becomes a lot less interesting. And it also, again, going back to kind of like the death rolls, by allowing failure to be a thing in your games, it adds more of an edge to the game. You know, when you're rolling the dice for these secret doors, you're thinking, this is important, I need to get this. You're not thinking, I'll just keep rolling until I get it. And because of that, it adds a certain edge to proceedings. So that's what I want to say on both of these. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, death and failure, you know, whilst they might feel bad in the short term, they can be very good things for your campaign in the long term. So please, 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 as a solo player, do not fudge your dice. Respect them. And that's it. That's all I want to say on this video. I mean, if you found it interesting, give it a like or maybe subscribe. And if there's any videos you'd like me to do, just mention them in the comments, and I'm sure I can elaborate perhaps a little bit more on some of the other areas if you want to know more about them. And once again, thank you for taking the time to watch this, and goodbye.